Good morning and welcome to the final session of the Mayflower Constitution Week Conference at the Center for Constitutional Studies at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah. I'm Scott Paul. I serve here in the center as interim director. As we conclude this conference, I express gratitude to UVU Provost, Dr. Wayne Vaught, and UVU President, Dr. Astrid Jimenez, for their support of our center. I also thank the members of our advisory board who provide invaluable guidance and direction for us as we execute on our mission. I also acknowledge Dr. Andy Bibby, who serves as the Associate Director of the Center. He has been the architect and the driving force behind this conference. And I must mention Carrie Dennis, our Events and Marketing Manager, who has worked diligently to make this conference happen under very unique circumstances. And for one last time in this conference, I recognize the passing of our dear friend and director, Dr. Rodney K. Smith, following an 8-year battle with cancer. Rod was an inspired leader and a consummate scholar whose goodness was felt by everyone he met. We miss him very much. We've included on the webpage for this conference a link to the center's tribute to Rod. I invite you to learn more about this great human being. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you the speakers for our final panel. Dr. Troy Smith is a professor of political science at Brigham Young University, Hawaii. His primary fields of interest are federal systems and government, complexity and public policy, and American government. He is a fellow at the Center for the Study of Federalism and an editor of the online Encyclopedia, Federalism in America, an encyclopedia. Dr. Smith first became interested in federalism when his East Coast graduate friends argued for reintroducing wolves into the Rocky Mountains, but opposed their reintroduction into the Adirondacks. His academic work has appeared in Publius, the Journal of Federalism, the Review of Politics, Congress and the Presidency, Thinking Skills and Creativity, and other sources. Julia Ernst joined the University of North Dakota Law School in 2011 and now serves as Associate Dean for Academic and Student Affairs and as an Associate Professor. She teaches constitutional law, legislation, international human rights advocacy, gender in the law, and professional foundations. Her research explores constitutional law, democracy, equality, and human rights. She also serves on the executive committee of the Women Lawyer section of the State Bar Association of North Dakota. Previously, Professor Ernst taught at the Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C. She received her Juris Doctorate from the University of Michigan, a master's degree from Georgetown, and her bachelor's from Yale. She is a Girl Scout volunteer and a member of the Sharon Lutheran Church in Grand Forks, North Dakota, where she resides with her family. And I do have to note a delightful connection that we discovered I believe, and Professor Ernst can correct me if I have this right, I believe that her first full-time or tenure track teaching position was at the University of North Dakota as an associate or as an adjunct professor there. It just so happens that the very first full-time teaching position for our director, Rod Smith, was also at the University of North Dakota in 1981. So it was just a nice discovery and some symmetry there. So we certainly just feel another bit of Rod's influence on this conference. So without further ado, Dr. Smith.
I'd like to thank Paul, Andy, Carrie, Jamie, and everyone else at the Center for Constitutional Studies for organizing and hosting this conference. And to all those who've participated so far, it's been a delight listening to your presentations. I'm going to talk about the political philosophy underlying the Mayflower Compact. I want to set the stage by drawing a parallel between then and now. Plymouth and Portland may seem like worlds apart, but in many ways they are not. Two inventions, the Gutenberg press in the 15th century and the internet in our age, have made it cheap and easy to spread controversial opinions and disrupt elite control. As but one example, yesterday, Polly Ha mentioned the social media and memes that separatist pilgrims used and created to spread their message. The result of the Gutenberg press was the Protestant Reformation and 80 years of war. The result of the internet is playing out before us, but challenging established beliefs and authorities and disrupting society is certainly part of its short legacy. Some think that there are only two options for peacefully resolving the divisions of our age: either a centralized system of government, a leviathan in Hobbes' words, that can prevent contention and conflict, or more democracy. Forgotten is the covenant model of government that inspired the Mayflower Compact and the United States federal system of government. That covenant idea is a fundamental component of Madison's Republican remedy for the Republican disease. It disperses power and favors ad hoc coalitions for joint action. We miss the full meaning of Madison's Republican remedy because the prevailing historical narrative of American constitutionalism and republicanism follows a secular stream, beginning with ancient Greece and Rome and tracing through Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, and others. This prevailing narrative ignores the fact that the 17th century was not a move towards secularism, but rather a return to the biblical text. From those biblical studies of the ancient Israeli Republic came ideas for using covenants to organize republican governments, and those ideas persist into our age. Because we think that America's roots are secular, we are surprised to learn that the Bible, and specifically the Old Testament, is the book cited most often by America's founding generation to explain their ideas of government. Indeed, many central ideas of modern political thought come from religious, not secular sources. To explain the covenant theory of government that informed the Mayflower Compact, I want to put it in its historical context and contrast it with the alternative model of government that was adopted by most continental European nations at the time. That is Jean Bodin's theory of sovereignty or centralized absolutism. On August 24th, 1572, on St. Bartholomew's Day in Paris, France, at a royal wedding feast celebrating the marriage between the king's sister, a Catholic, and the Secretary of Navy, a Huguenot Protestant, an apparent assassination attempt failed. But the killing spread out into the streets, city, and surrounding areas. At the end of a week, some 3,000 to 30,000 people were killed. Killed in that melee was a professor of Jean Bodin. Distraught by his professor's death, Bodin sought a means to prevent such future bloodshed. He eventually developed a theory of government based on absolute sovereignty. His basic idea was that public safety and order could best be achieved by giving the full political power to a single sovereign ruler, whose decisions could not be questioned or challenged. This would prevent disagreements and disputes that would lead to contention, conflict, and war. Thomas Hobbes later added to Bodin's model the idea that the sovereign must be above the law. However, earlier in that century, a renaissance in Hebrew studies had convinced other scholars that societies could be founded and governed via covenants, as was the ancient Israeli Republic. These scholars found examples of covenant societies in their neighborhoods in recent history, from the Hanseatic League, the Swiss Confederation, and Germanic tribes, to the spirit of association that organized guilds, churches, and societies of their time. The leading political covenant theorist was Johannes Althusius, who was inspired to find an alternative to Bodin's theory of centralized sovereign rule. The idea of using covenants to organize society caught on. Religious groups established via covenant were called covenant societies, and political societies, political groups founded on covenants were called federal societies, from the Latin term feudus, which means treaty, pact, or covenant. The foundational premise of covenant philosophy is that human nature contains a mixture of good and evil. Consequently, chaos is likely to reign without some unifying element, either explicit or tacit, that joins independent individuals or groups into relationships based on mutual respect and reciprocity. A covenant is a solemn voluntary agreement among independent individuals or communities that have as much equal status as possible. A covenant creates a partnership to achieve common objectives that benefit all the parties to the covenant while preserving each partner's identity and autonomy. The key focus of covenant is on relationships, and a covenant is, in essence, the constitutionalization of relationship. When covenants are done well, covenant commitments help shape individuals and the community they form towards fulfillment. While progress towards fulfillment is possible, it is not inevitable, because the mixture of original goodness and fallen sinfulness in humans means that human endeavors can easily go awry. In contrast, in contemporary liberalism, which is increasingly individualistic, or communitarianism, which neglects the individual, covenants provide the basis for shared rule to resolve common issues and problems while protecting self-rule and independence. Covenants protect the covenanting parties' separateness and distinctiveness while also situating them into relationships that form community. Covenants harmonize an individual's competing needs to both belong and for independence. Covenants are often compared to contracts, but they differ in significant ways. Covenants and contracts are both reciprocal. That is, they bind the agreeing parties to certain behaviors and promise certain rewards for fulfilling the obligations. Contracts, however, are narrowly tailored legal agreements that require fulfilling the contract's minimum terms. Consequently, contracts are written in immense detail. Covenants are moral agreements, broadly reciprocal, and as such, their obligation extends beyond the letter of the law. This makes them both flexible in certain respects and firm in others. The relationship created by covenants is often compared to a marriage. In a marriage, one does not fulfill their marriage covenant simply by being civil to their spouse or doing the minimum to sustain the relationship. Rather, one is expected to be fully committed and engaged to the success of the marriage. Such commitment creates fulfilling relationships and meaningful lives that is not achieved by mere contract. During the 17th century, covenant and compact were used interchangeably. In the 18th century, covenant was used by those who saw the hand of God in human events, while those seeking to secularize the political system were more likely to use the term compact. The Mayflower Compact would have been understood as a covenant by its signers. The idea of covenant governance that informed Reformed Protestants, like the Pilgrims on the Mayflower, came significantly from studying the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. It is there we find some foundational concepts that inform covenant or federal governance. The Hebrew Bible gives two words for the verb to rule or to govern: redu and memshala. Redu is the rule of superior over subordinates, that is, governance between unequals. For example, God uses redu to describe man's dominion over the animals. Redu is inappropriate, however, in human relations, as exemplified by the variant rodan, which means dictator or tyrant. The proper form of rule or governance among humans is the rule between equals, or at least potential equals. This is memshala. The proper relationship between husband and wife, governors and the public is memshala. Under memshala, governance is shared. Even God himself does not rule humans as rodan, but approaches man as equals or potential equals. And through covenants, invites humans into an active partnership with him. A primary value in covenants is freedom. By grounding covenant governance in equality between partners, covenants privilege and protect the partner's freedom in two ways. First, covenants limit each party's natural powers. Thus, even God, in covenanting with humans, agrees to constrain his powers to protect human freedom. Second, covenants provide protection and benefits to improve one's capacities and freedoms. It joins people together for collective action. Under Rodin, similar protection may be provided by a powerful dictator, but at a significant loss of freedom. Freedom is indeed an essential objective of covenant governance. By defining the proper form of rule between humans as that between equals, and with a commitment to protecting individual liberty, leadership under the covenant model rests on persuasion and negotiation rather than command and obedience. In the ancient Hebrew, there is no word for obey. The word commonly translated as obey, shemoa, is actually to hearken. Hearkening entails a freedom to choose. To hearken is to open one's mind and heart to being persuaded. Persuasion, properly understood, obligates a speaker to respect the audience's mind and independence and not to engage in manipulation or pandering. This requires the leaders in turn to hearken to their audience. Such back and forth speaking and listening entails bargaining and negotiation in good faith and with full commitment to the covenant's terms. Covenants result in moral obligations and responsibilities that are crafted and mutually acceptable. While covenants must be consistent with the laws of nature and human nature to succeed, the idea is not the well-ordered state based on natural law that can be imposed top-down, but rather a community built from within by covenant and sustained via persuasion. In this manner, covenants place humans in relationships in general and dynamic terms, requiring both flexibility and persuasion rather than command. The Hebrew Renaissance of the 16th and 17th centuries recovered an alternative means to found order and govern societies. Martin Luther, interestingly enough, was not interested. Luther wanted to reform Catholic doctrines, but he retained the church's centralized hierarchical structure. In disputes between princes and peasants, Luther sided with the princes. It was the Reformed Protestant leaders, inspired by Hebraic studies, who turned to covenants to establish their societies. Of the Reformed Protestant groups who used covenants, Calvinism gets most of the attention, but it is actually the Swiss tradition that had the greatest influence in the political realm. Calvinism's founder, John Calvin, studied the equivalent of political science, not theology, in France. Based in the French-speaking city of Geneva, Calvinism resembled French ideas of hierarchical power and order. Calvin wrote often of covenant, but his idea of covenant was unilateral. It emphasized God's sovereignty, promise, and responsibility. Calvinism also included a strong elitist element that separated God's elect from the reprobate. Together, these ideas contributed to Calvin's preference for aristocracy and support for public measures of extreme intolerance punished by great severity. In contrast, the Huguenots who were slaughtered in St. Bartholomew's Day massacre were Calvinist. Calvinism also influenced the Netherlands Confederation. Yet Calvinism was less likely to move covenant into the political realm. So figures like John Knox, who studied with Calvin in Geneva and took the covenant idea to Scotland, was inspired in his political ideas more by the Swiss tradition. Similarly, many historians mistakenly associate Reformed Protestantism with Calvinism, and consequently think that the early American colonists were Calvinist. Calvinists did emigrate to America, but they were mostly influential in the southern states. Most Reformed Protestant immigrants to America were from the Swiss tradition. The Pilgrims on board the Mayflower were from that Swiss tradition. The Swiss tradition, based in the German-speaking city of Zurich, resembled the local culture of Swiss and German self-government and federalism. The Swiss tradition understood federal covenants as a bilateral agreement based on equality, whose purpose is to foster liberty and achieve the common good. Human relationships and societies depend on covenants, whether explicit or tacit. Healthy societies have an interplay between private covenants, such as those that form marriages and other private associations, and public covenants that form federal societies. Together, these public and private covenants create federal systems that are dynamic and flexible and can scale from minuscule to large. The essential elements of federal societies are voluntary participation, the rights and responsibilities of membership, commitment to the group and its patterns of governance, and holding leaders to their covenanted obligations. Once adopted, individuals have a responsibility to fulfill the terms of the covenant. Hence, it is the covenant, not command, that is the basis of law. One of those elements that leaders need to be held to their covenant obligations stems from the belief that because human nature is a mixture of good and evil, leaders may abuse their powers. From this came the idea that political power must be limited. To do that, federal theorists developed the following ideas. The concept of popular sovereignty, that is, the supreme authority to rule resides not in the rulers, but in the people. The need for a constitution to be written down, to divide powers within every level of political organization, create checks and balances between institutions, separate civil and ecclesiastical powers, expect the people to vigilantly monitor government, expect government officials to hear and honor minority views, and grant the people a right to revolution if the leaders or organization violates the covenant and abuses its powers. This was a hearty rejection of the divine right of kings and Bode's idea of centralized sovereignty. All of these ideas were developed well before Hobbes, Locke, and other secularizing philosophers. When the Mayflower landed in Plymouth Bay 400 years ago, all adult males intending to reside at the New Plymouth colony consented by signature to the Mayflower Compact, a 3-paragraph document that created a new society, defined that society's fundamental values and commitments, and established a government for that society. The Mayflower Compact gave its signers a community to belong to, respect based on equality, and the right to be heard. A fundamental component of the Pilgrims' success, Nick Bunker mentioned yesterday, was their positive morale that helped them through the harsh New England winters. I can't help but wonder how much of that positive morale came from their political system. For the rest of the 17th century, all the major immigrant groups to America came from the covenant tradition. The Anglicans in Virginia, the Puritans in New England, and the Scottish Presbyterians in the Middle Colonies. Britain, for various reasons, neglected colonial America, leaving it free to experiment with and develop federal methods of governance. The Mayflower Compact set the mold for consensual self-government as ideal and practice. And for the next 80 years, American colonists wrote over 100 other founding documents similar to the Mayflower Compact. Where the Mayflower Compact joined individuals into a society, future covenants joined communities into a larger entity that would simultaneously recognize and preserve the smaller unit's freedom, a precursor to the United States system of federalism. Covenantal systems are not without problems. A dangerous tendency of covenant groups is tribalism and elitism. When a covenant society views itself as distinct and chosen, they may choose to separate themselves from others and thereby become tribalistic. Elitism develops within the group from the idea that worldly success comes from keeping the covenant. Thus, the successful may feel their privileges are merited and they are favored by God. Ancient Israel countered these problems by requiring hospitality to strangers and significant economic redistribution. In the 1760s, the American colonists found themselves outside the tribe, denied common British rights acquired during the Glorious Revolution of 1688. In response, Americans developed the idea of universal natural rights, essentially extending equality beyond covenant partners to include the entire human race. In contrast, settlers in South Carolina and South Africa, both of which were largely settled by Huguenots, developed philosophies justifying slavery. Meanwhile, back in continental Europe, the ruling powers ended 80 years of religious warfare with the treaties of Westphalia of 1648. Westphalia created our modern nation state on the basis of Baudin's theory of sovereign rule. Accordingly, rulers received full sovereignty, that is, the power and authority to decide all of the nation's important decisions, including what religion everyone in the nation would belong to. Science was also established as the state's official epistemology. The underlying idea is that a single sovereign, acting under the advice of scientific experts, would provide the laws necessary to secure a stable political order and prevent contention and conflict. This method is centralized and top-down to attain unity through uniformity. In conclusion, federal theology, and particularly the Swiss tradition of Reformed Protestantism, provided the foundation and inspiration behind the Mayflower Compact. Federal theology evolved from a renaissance in Hebrew studies that drew lessons from the ancient Israeli Republic to provide guidance on constitutions, institutions, and practices for Republican government. From that and continued study of the Bible, federal theorists devised the basis for a political system that would promote the common good, preserve human freedom, and foster human fulfillment. In doing so, they developed many political concepts still used today, including institutional means to limit political power. The Mayflower Compact was a covenant or social compact that initiates America's experiment in self-government. Occasionally, our social compacts need to be made explicit and renewed. To do so is to remind us of both the rights and responsibilities of living within an ordered society based on mutual respect and reciprocity. As we face the divisions of our century, rather than turning to greater centralization or Jacobean democracy, we might find inspiration in the federal tradition that inspired the Mayflower Compact. For it is in that federal philosophy that we can understand both the promise and the means of fulfilling the American motto, E pluribus unum, from the many one. Thank you.
Thank you, Troy, for your excellent presentation. I should have pointed out before that Troy is coming to us from Laie, Hawaii, which is 4 hours behind Utah, which meant we started this session at 7 a.m. his time. So thank you for joining us so early in the morning. I'm sure many of us wish we were there with you on the North Shore. A quick note, at the conclusion of Professor Ernst's remarks, we'll have a question and answer session. Should you like to submit a question for either of our speakers, you may do so in the comments section for the YouTube feed for this conference, or via email by emailing constitution@uvu.edu. With that, we look forward to hearing from Professor Ernst.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Can you see the initial screen?
Looks good.
Good. Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. I'm so delighted to be a part of this conference. I initially would like to, in light of and in honor of the speakers who just went before us, the University of North Dakota School University as a whole just recently adopted a land acknowledgement statement. So I would like to read that. It says the purpose of our land acknowledgement is that it is important to understand the history that has brought the people to the land on which they reside. A land acknowledgement statement seeks to show respect, recognition, and gratitude to Indigenous peoples who call the land home. And so here is the University of North Dakota's land acknowledgement statement. Today, the University of North Dakota rests on the ancestral lands of the Pembina and Redbake lands of Ojibwe and the Dakota Oyate, presently existing as the composite parts of the Red Lake, Turtle Mountain, White Earth Bands, and the Dakota tribes of Minnesota and North Dakota. We acknowledge the people who resided here for generations and recognize that the spirit of the Ojibwe and Oyate people permeates this land. As a university community, we will continue to build upon our relations with the First Nations of the state of North Dakota, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate Nation, Spirit Lake Nation, Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, and the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians. And our president, Joshua Wynn, signed that into existence on February 7th of 2020. So just recently signed that land acknowledgement statement. So thank you for allowing me to read that. So I am so delighted to follow Troy with his presentation because it so wonderfully sets up the discussion of the Mayflower Compact, celebrating 400 years subsequent, 400 years of U.S. influence on U.S. democracy. And let me go ahead and advance my slides here. There we go. As long as this goes, for some reason, there we go. Okay, good. So I want to acknowledge first, this is my mother, Janet Ernst. You'll see she's wearing a Mayflower medallion. This was when she came out to a presentation that I gave on this topic last year. And I owe my interest in the Mayflower and the Mayflower Compact to my mother and to both of our ancestors. We are descendants of John and Eleanor Billington, and more on them in a little bit. We also were planning to be at this moment out in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and between Plymouth and Boston and Provincetown in 2020. This was before COVID hit, but the General Society of Mayflower Descendants that Kevin spoke about yesterday, they were having a huge meeting. They have a triennial meeting once every 3 years where about 600 people attend. And at this meeting, they were expecting thousands upon thousands. So they were having it in all three of those cities. Unfortunately, due to COVID, it had to be postponed, but we're hoping that it will be held next year. So hopefully we'll be there at this time next year. But this gives me the wonderful privilege to be here with you today to talk about the Mayflower Compact and the US Constitution. So very delighted to be here with you today. See, advancing forward again, we'll talk a little bit. Now, please forgive me as well. I come from a legal background rather than a historical background. So I am going to focus a bit more in on the actual words of the Mayflower Compact and how the Mayflower Compact actually influenced some of the subsequent documents throughout the colonial period. As Troy mentioned, there were hundreds of documents that had that same covenant and compact foundation that was brought over from the covenant heritage in Europe. We'll talk a little bit about the Declaration of Independence, of course, the Revolution, the Articles of Confederation, and then the US Constitution, and throughout that, the evolution of US democracy. As we have learned about through the course of the last couple of days, the Mayflower was originally headed to Virginia. You can see down here, and I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the original destination of the Mayflower was to go to Virginia. Now, they called Virginia at the time, all the way from what we know as Virginia, the settlement of Jamestown Colony, Jamestown, Virginia, et cetera, and what the current state of Virginia is, all the way up through the Hudson Valley. That was all counted as Virginia. So as you heard yesterday, the Pilgrims actually wanted to go to the Hudson River Valley and settle there. And that's where they had their charter from the king, enabling them to settle in the Hudson River Valley. Well, as you know, they got blown off course here and ended up over in Cape Cod. And although they did attempt to sail down the coast and go to where they were originally supposed to be going in the Hudson River, they ran into shoals, they ran into rocky weather, and the captain knew that winter was coming, to say a popular phrase today. And so they went back around inside the Cape, where they knew that they would be a bit more sheltered at least, and would hopefully be able to find a place that they could then inhabit. Well, there were quite a few people on board who were not of the original religious community. So as you heard yesterday, there were several different groups who were aboard the Mayflower. The ones were the saints, and that's who we traditionally think of as the Pilgrims, the religious community who lived in Leiden for about 10 years. And then when they realized that the situation in Leiden was not going to be hospitable for them, they decided to make the trek to the New World. But they also knew that they would not survive if they didn't have additional people there who had trades, who had skills, who would be able to help them build a colony and start basically from anew. And so they brought over along with them people whom they called the strangers, and our ancestors, the Billingtons, were among those strangers. And lo and behold, many of those strangers, likely including John Billington, started making mutinous musings on the Mayflower, saying, well, now, since we are landing in an area far, far north of where your actual patent is, or where the charter from the king is, you actually have no legal authority over us. We made an agreement to go only to the Hudson River, to Virginia. And since you have no legal authority here in this part of the world, we can just go off and we have no obligation to you. We can do whatever we please. And of course, this threatened the very survival of all of the settlers, the prospective settlers. And so this brought about then, before they were allowed to land, this brought about the necessity of creating the Mayflower Compact. So the Mayflower Compact itself was really a happenstance based on the fact that there were several people who were mutinying. So our family likes to take a bit of credit for creating the Mayflower Compact by our ancestor who was a bit rebellious. So let's take a look here at the Mayflower Compact itself. Again, forgive me for liking to get into the actual wording, but I think it is very important. So it starts off, in the name of God, amen. And sorry, the pictures here are a little bit over the actual Mayflower Compact itself. So it says, we whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign, Lord King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, etc., having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. You see, they do say here that they're in the wrong place, right? Do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant, there's that term covenant that Troy just talked about, and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation, and for the furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof, we hereunder subscribed our names at Cape Cod the 11th of November in the year of our reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, Ireland the 18th, and Scotland the 54th, Anno Domini 1620. And of course, the signature of the 41 adult males were there as well. So let's break this up a little bit. First of all, a lot of times we think of the Pilgrims as fleeing England and fleeing the crown and fleeing the subjugation of the government and the church, right? They were feeling that they were persecuted. And you heard about some of that persecution yesterday in the conversations that were had. However, here they are attesting that they are loyal subjects of King James and that they're doing this for the honor of king and country, and acknowledging this is the year of the reign of their Lord Sovereign King James. So they're actually acknowledging and attesting that they are loyal subjects of King James in particular. Let's also look here again. We often think of the Pilgrims as being these forebearers of freedom of religion and the separation of church and state. But here we see in their founding document, of course, the very first words, "In the name of God, amen," and acknowledging the king as the defender of the faith, and having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith, and in the presence of God, mutually covenanting to one another. So you see that they're actually reflecting their Christianity right in the document itself. Now, interestingly, if you take a look here, you remember that the Pilgrims were separatists, and therefore that's part of the reason why they were strongly persecuted by the church and by the state, and basically driven out of their country for practicing the religion that they believe. However, here they did not mention the fact that they were separatists, and they did not mention the fact that King James and the Christian church, or the Church of England, that they were trying to break away from them. They were using these very generic terms. And in part, of course, this was so as not to antagonize King James. And so as in part, most likely, to bring in the strangers, who the strangers most likely would have been members of the Church of England and not separatists. And so they wrote a much broader vision of religion into their document. And this religious tolerance, although they weren't entirely tolerant of all religious faiths, they did practice a much greater sense of religious tolerance than had they experienced back in England, and that some of the other colonies practiced in the United States, or in the colonies as well as they developed. Of course, they acknowledged the voyage was in a different area. And here, this is very important as well, because this sets up the governance of the consent of the governed. So again, just as Troy was saying, they do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic for better ordering and preservation, and unto which we promise all due submission. So they are adopting a really revolutionary form of government, that they're coming together for the good of the whole, and all together adopting this as a part of this concept of the consent of the governed that Troy mentioned as well. And then here we set forth what they're going to be doing with this. So they're enacting by virtue hereof, they're constituting and framing such just and equal laws. And again, here are those concepts of justice and equality, which again, in the very hierarchical world from which they came in England, the hierarchy of the nobility versus the serfs, and the hierarchy of governance, and the hierarchy of the ecclesiastical governance within the church. This was really radical and revolutionary to create just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. So again, I'm going to come back to these themes of the consent of the governed, the freedom of religion, and the just and equal laws, this concept of equality that the Pilgrims were setting forth with respect to the Mayflower Compact. Now, of course, it wasn't entirely all equal, although women, as we heard from our first speakers yesterday, certainly had a much greater voice within the congregation and likely within the governance of the colony. They did not sign the Mayflower Compact. It was all of the adult males except some who were sick. signed the compact. So, so there wasn't a complete equality, of course, as we wouldn't expect in that time period, but it was a very, very progressive document for its time. And of course, as we know, they settled, they landed on Plymouth Rock. We see here the picture. They had a very, very harsh winter that first winter. Fewer than 50% of their members survived the winter. They had originally elected John Carver as their first governor. He unfortunately passed away that spring after the harsh winter. And of course, the Mayflower departed and went back to England that spring. Upon Governor Carver's death, John Carver, they elected William Bradford, whom, as you heard as well, was then the governor for approximately 30 years, the governor of Plymouth Colony. So on and off. So he was a very, very instrumental person. Now, I want to point out as well that how revolutionary this was, that the Pilgrims created a civil government and elected their governor and elected a civil governor. They did not elect the spiritual leader. William Brewster was their spiritual leader, you see here. They did not choose a theocratic government or a government of the religious leaders. They also did not choose Miles Standish, as was mentioned yesterday. They did not choose an authoritarian government. As Troy was just mentioning, they did not have one single ruler that they put all of their in more of a dictatorship or an authoritarian government ruled by military force by any means. They did not choose him. Instead, they chose William Bradford, John Carver first, and then William Bradford as a civilian government. Again, John Billington, if anyone is interested, I have lots of John Billington stories that are kind of fun. He was known as kind of the rabble rouser of the Plymouth colony. William Bradford called him a knave and called the whole Billington family the most profane among all of the families in Plymouth colony. So he's quite scandalous. So feel free to ask any questions you have during the question and answer period, and I'd be happy to answer more. We've talked too about the first Thanksgiving, about how crucial the relationship was between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans who were indigenous to that region, and how the Pilgrims could not have survived, the settlers could not have survived. Of course, it's been romanticized, and there's a lot of mythology that has grown up about it that some of our other speakers have talked about, but it's very important to acknowledge. The Plymouth colony then grew. It became more established. New people began arriving in the colony. It had a bit more of an established and regularized form of governance that they were developing. So about 16 years after they arrived, they developed the Pilgrim Code of Law. So they had been governing kind of ad hoc under the Mayflower Compact, but they decided to, and King Charles at the time became king in 1625, and he asked the settlers to go ahead and codify their law. So they came up with the Pilgrim Code of Law. Now you'll notice here on the right-hand side of the page, we have a depiction again of the Mayflower Compact, because again, that was very central to even the Pilgrim Code of Law that 16 years later. And you see down here, this is actually in the Capitol building of the United States. And you see a quote from William Henry Harrison underneath the depiction of the the Mayflower Compact. And it said, "The only legitimate right to govern is an express grant of power from the governed." So again, acknowledging that heritage from the Mayflower Compact, the consent of the governed. So in the Pilgrim Code of Law, the second sentence in the Pilgrim Code of Law, right at the very front of it, said, acknowledges the debt to the Mayflower Compact itself, which then at the time was called the Mayflower Combination, or the Plymouth Combination. So, so it says, "Now being assembled according to the said order, and having read the combination, the Mayflower Compact, made at Cape Cod on the 11th of November, 1620, and finding that as freeborn subjects of the state of England," remember they're still calling themselves loyal subjects of the state of England, "we hither came endowed with all the singular privileges belonging to such. In the first place, we think good that it be established for an act according to the due privileges of the subject aforesaid, and then this is the important part in terms of consent of the governed, that no imposition, law, or ordinance be made or imposed upon us by ourselves or others, at present or to come, but as such as shall be made or imposed upon us by consent. So again, that consent of the governed, going on through some of these important documents that were the founding codes within the colonies. The Pilgrim Code of Law, in addition to reaffirming this consent of the governed, reaffirms this concept of equality. For example, taxes shall be laid upon the whole without partiality. So as the freeman be not spared for his freedom, but the levy be equal. Again, that concept of equality. The code required the governor to swear an oath, my Girl Scout honor here, the Girl Scout sign, but to faithfully, equally, and indifferently to administer justice in all cases coming before you as governor. Each assistant to the governor also swore an oath to faithfully, truly, and justly assist the governor for the execution of justice in all cases and toward all persons coming before you without partiality. Again, that concept of equality within the governance. So Plymouth Colony, again, as it was growing and becoming stronger here, they eventually, here we go, I'm getting my notes out here. They also were a bit more tolerant, as I was mentioning before, in terms of religion. And in fact, there's a story of Bradford when some newcomers, they call them, folks who would come after the first settlers came, and they practiced their religion differently. It was still the Christian religion, but they said that according to their Christian religion, they were not supposed to work on the holiday, for example, on Christmas. Whereas under the Pilgrims tradition, they saw no difference because Christ, there was no Christmas at the time. People worked all the way through, so they worked on Christmas Day as well. Well, the newcomers said, according to our religious beliefs, we shouldn't have to work on the holiday. And William Bradford said, okay, we understand that. So you can practice your belief in accordance with your religious beliefs. There's another fun story along with that too. So if anyone is interested in delving a little further in that, we can talk about it. But again, they were a bit more tolerant in terms of religion. You heard just in our last presentation, in the last panel, the complicated relationship between the settlers and the Native American societies and their very sophisticated governments that they had. So I won't go into that in depth, but again, it was a very complicated relationship again with respect to the colonies. So as the Plymouth Plantation, as you know, eventually became absorbed into Massachusetts Bay Colony. By around 1640, there were about 1,000 people. By 1643, there were about 2,000 people. By the mid-1640s, the colony had over 3,000 people. So you could see it was growing quite extensively, not nearly as extensive as the Great Puritan migration in Boston that we'll mention in a minute. But it was growing quite extensively. And we're very fortunate to have these histories, Mort's Relation and the history that William Bradford wrote of Plymouth Plantation that tells us about the kind of the ascent of the Plymouth Plantation and then its absorption, kind of decline and absorption into Massachusetts Bay Colony. So let's see. I'm going to make sure that we're getting everything here. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention as well. We tend to call them pilgrims now, but just to reiterate that they did not call themselves pilgrims. Pilgrims was actually only mentioned once in William Bradford's account, saying that the pilgrims came out again of Leiden and came to the New World, but only mentioned it once. They didn't refer to themselves as pilgrims at all. And of course, this was a religious reference, the reference to pilgrims. It wasn't until Daniel Webster, who was a great orator, he gave the speech on the bicentennial celebration of the Mayflower's landing, and he spoke very eloquently about the Pilgrim Fathers, and that's really where this term pilgrim came about. As you heard, the Pilgrims and the settlers all throughout New England. The pilgrims initially had come, the saints in particular, because of their strongly held religious belief. And they had that religious faith, that religious fervor that according to William Bradford, he really regretted the fact that they lost that, as you heard yesterday. And the newcomers and their progeny, the descendants of the first settlers, really were starting to focus on land and on their economic well-being and on growth. And of course, the desire for land came into that, leading up to the King Philip's War, and the divestment of the first indigenous populations of their land, which again is a very tragic consequence. And of course, we saw that throughout the movement west throughout the history of the United States as well. So some great tragedies there. So I want to acknowledge that as well. All right, so of course we know we're talking about Plymouth Colony and its absorption into Massachusetts Bay Colony, and how Plymouth Colony and the Mayflower Compact initially helped set the stage, but what was going on in some of the other colonies? So let's delve a little bit into that as well. As we know, the Plymouth Colony was not the first. In fact, there were many attempts at settlement previously. Of course, the South America and Central America was largely inhabited, settled, and quite a few settlements already from the Iberian Peninsula, from Spain. Of course, we know that Virginia was the first permanent English settlement. Of course, there had been a few attempts previously, like the settlement at Roanoke. But in 1607, the Virginia settlement was established. And of course, the scarcity and hunger that we talked about, the starving time that our previous speakers talked about, the original settlement of Jamestown was quite unstable. And they actually were, the settlers had gotten aboard ships and they were about ready to leave when the supply ships came, the resupply ships came from England, and convinced them to turn around and go back. And so that's why Jamestown actually existed then still, rather than being abandoned. But they actually adopted in 1610 and 1611, they adopted a code of laws. So this was before the Mayflower Compact. It was before the Pilgrim Code of Laws. So again, we have this precedent here in Virginia as well. And they actually had adopted their House of Burgesses in 1619. And they had the very first workers' strike because recorded in colonial America, the first people who were able to vote were only the English males. And the Polish artisans, who were also in the colony, they went on strike because they weren't allowed to vote, and they actually conceded. And so the artisans then were, the male artisans of Polish descent and Slovak descent, were granted equal voting rights. So you can see this trend of equality in the Americas as well. Of course, we know too that equality was tempered by slavery. The first slaves were brought to Jamestown in 1619. We heard a lot about that during the 400th anniversary of the establishment of slavery in the United States last year. Okay, so the sister colony, just to the north of them, Massachusetts Bay Colony. This is John Winthrop. Again, they were a bit more theocratic. They only allowed people within the established church, the Puritan church, to vote. So that very much narrowed the citizenship within the Puritan colony. So they really had more of a theocracy. John Winthrop actually wrote into the first Book of Laws, or Book of Liberties, excuse me. It's called the Book of Liberties, but he wrote into the Book of Liberties. He ensconced the institution of slavery, unfortunately, in Massachusetts. And so slavery, a lot of people don't realize that about a third of the slave owners at the time that the US Constitution was written, about a third of the slave owners were actually in the northern colonies, or the northern states. Of course, they were, Massachusetts Bay Colony was also a bit less tolerant, more theocratic, less tolerant of other religions. They they really persecuted, this is Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, who were persecuted to such an extent that they left and founded Rhode Island. Roger Williams believed staunchly in religious freedom, in the separation of church and state, and also in fair dealings with American Indians, and also the abolition of slavery. So his views were not tolerated, and so he left. Anne Hutchinson was tried as well, and she had to leave as well. She believed in equal rights for men and women and had her own way of interpreting the Bible. And so she left and helped to start the colony of Rhode Island as well. Of course, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut came about. Similarly, John Haynes and the Puritan minister Thomas Hooker were driven out of Massachusetts because of their different beliefs. They adopted the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which again gave voting rights. They had a written constitution. They believed much more in freedom of religion. So again, that was an important theme in Connecticut. William Penn received a patent from the king to establish a colony, Pennsylvania, which was, and he was of the Society of Friends, the Quakers. So they were very, very tolerant of religion. And he established the frame of government in Pennsylvania that ensured freedom of religion, guaranteeing all traditional rights enjoyed by English subjects. He created a balance of powers to prevent rulers from becoming authoritarian. And we heard from Troy how important that was as well. And many of the Puritans had that as well in their compact theory. Of course, not all was good and equal and tolerant. Again, going back to Massachusetts Bay Colony, we know of the Salem witch trials in the late 1600s. But fortunately, this was the dawning as well of the Age of Enlightenment, otherwise known as the Age of Reason. And so we have all of these philosophers here who are really picking up on this covenant theory of both religious organization and political organization that Troy Smith just talked about, and really taking that and making it popular in terms of the philosophy and the political philosophy. So we see here John Locke. John Locke wrote about the social compact. He wrote about the idea that the government needs to be only with the consent of the governed. And he argued for liberty and religious tolerance and the right to life and property. And was a very influential person both on Americans and in the American Revolution and on the French Revolutions. So you can see here John Locke, John Locke was born in 1632. This was 12 years after, when he was a baby, 12 years after the Mayflower Compact. And of course, the Mayflower Compact and those ideals were traveling back and forth across the continent in terms of this ideal of compact, both for religious societies and political societies. So we see here Thomas Hobbes, Immanuel Kant, Sir Isaac Newton, Voltaire, Rousseau, and also our friends Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. The colonial governments were adopting these theories of the Age of Enlightenment as well. This is in colonial Williamsburg in Virginia. And they were adopting all of these philosophies in their governance systems and in their colonial documents, just as Troy was saying as well. Now, King George had again, as Troy was saying, there was really a laissez-faire or hands-off from the crown to the colonies during the initial parts of the initial time of the colonial government. However, King George, when he came into power, he wanted to establish a more favorable balance of trade to England and less favorable to the colonies. He also wanted to raise taxes on the colonies because of various wars that were going on. So he instituted the Stamp Acts and the tax on tea that we've heard about. Well, in 1765, John Adams, one of the founders of our country, started publishing a series of articles railing against the Stamp Acts, and he referred back to the Pilgrims. He referred back to those who escaped from England and escaped the oppression, and so was starting to draw upon the early settlers and even the Pilgrims to say, hey, wait a minute, we don't want to have this oppressive ruling from the king. And in fact, we should not have taxation without representation. They shouldn't be imposing these things on us. You've all, I'm sure, heard of the Boston Tea Party that happened in 1773. The Continental Congress started this confederation, again, of all of the different states, or all of the different colonies initially, came together for the first time in a Continental Congress to say, hey, we need to start figuring out how we can push back against the oppressiveness of the king coming over from England. And of course, we had the start of the American Revolution. The Continental Congress told all of the colonies that we are looking toward the possibility of independence. So encouraged the colonies to start developing their own, not only declarations of independence. So the Virginia Declaration of Rights came before, just a few months before, and influenced our own Declaration of Independence. And the colonies were also starting to write their own constitutions. And then, of course, we have our own framers of government who were deeply, deeply influenced by all of these colonial documents that were espousing the consent of the governed, the separation of church and state, the freedoms and equalities and liberties, the separation of powers within those governments. So, as you know, Thomas Jefferson and others wrote the Declaration of Independence, which again, some of this language that they're created equal. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And I'm almost going to wrap up here. That they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among those life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And that to secure these rights, governments are deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Of course, we had the initial Articles of Confederation, which was very weak, and that threatened to tear the fledgling nation apart with Shays' Rebellion, etc. And so we had the actual Constitutional Convention in 1787, written again by Ben Franklin and George Washington, whom we, as you heard, were very highly influenced, by the way, by the Native American confederations in developing their constitutions. So we owe a great debt to our Native American heritage as well for our own constitution. Again, the Constitution itself ensconced the separation of powers, checks and balances intended to prevent authoritarian power in one ruler. It was somewhat representative, much more so than in Europe. However, not really representative as we think about it today. Only white male property owners, or only about 6% of the population, were allowed to vote. But it was the seeds of democracy, the seeds of more equality. And then they also talked about the fact with separation of church and state and freedom of religion. In the Article 6, no religious test shall be required as a qualification of any office or public trust in the United States. And of course, the First Amendment with the Establishment Clause, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Of course, you see, we don't have much equality here. Of course, we had slavery. You see the slaves being imported over on the boats, which were even more horrific circumstances than the hardships you heard about on the Mayflower. It wasn't until the Civil War that we finally had emancipation. And the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which gave equality, and the 15th Amendment, the right to vote. So here's the 14th Amendment guaranteeing the equal protection of laws. Of course, as we know, that equal protection of laws was not quite equal. It still wasn't until 1920 that women, both African-American women and white women and other women, were allowed to vote until the 20s. And it wasn't until 1923 that Native Americans even were granted citizenship. Those who were members of sovereign tribes, they weren't even considered citizens of the United States, so they weren't allowed to vote. So of course we know that there are many, the Constitution wasn't perfect. There were many flaws. Of course, no society is a perfect society. However, this great American experiment and the striving toward perfection and striving toward equality and justice and all of these values that the Pilgrims first brought over was so important. In fact, so much so that Alexis de Tocqueville came over from Europe and to examine the American experiment. And he said that the situation of equality in America is so much greater than anything in Europe. Again, as you heard Troy talking about this in our last session. And part of this is because of civil society and the value that Americans place on being involved in their government and involved in civic society and civic organizations. This is where people sometimes ask, don't I get depressed, or, with how divisive things are in our country today, and many things break my heart and are imperfect in the United States, and we still need to work on greater strides toward these values that the Pilgrims brought over. But there's so many organizations and entities, including the Utah Valley University Center for Constitutional Studies, and all of you participating, all of the students. These are some of our students who just graduated. I know there are many students on the call. And I'll leave with, when I was initially writing this paper and gave the presentation, Judge Ralph Erickson, who kindly allowed me to share this, he wrote an email to me saying, "Thanks for being willing to bring this to the fore. I'm convinced that if each of us had a better understanding of the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, the Mayflower Compact, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, Articles of Confederation, Virginia Declaration of Rights, the Northwest Ordinance, we would much better understand the Constitution and the liberties it guarantees to each of us." So I want to thank everyone on this symposium for continuing to shed light on the Mayflower Compact, on our history. Again, hopefully we will delve more deeply from that initial history that many of us learned as children, delve more deeply into that and learn from our descendants about the importance of our history. And so again, I want to thank all of you. I'm sorry I went over a little bit over on time, but thank all of you so much. This has been an amazing conference, and I really appreciate the ability to talk with you here today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ernst, for your fantastic presentation. For those of you who want to know more, we have a link on our website, on the website for this conference. If you scroll down to the schedule and look next to Professor Ernst's line in the schedule, if you click on her title, the title of her talk today, it will take you to her paper from which she drew her remarks, which is entitled Mayflower Compact, Celebrating 400 Years of Influence on U.S. Democracy. It's a fantastic paper and just really goes what she's presented today, developments throughout United States history in kind of whistle-stop fashion. She really delves into them much more. And so I think those of you who want to know more have a great opportunity to go and read her paper. So thank you very much for that. We've now come to the question and answer portion of this session. So if you'd like to submit a question, we still have time to get them in. You can do it in the comments section on the YouTube feed for this session, or you can email us at constitution@uvu.edu. So I think we have our panelists with us. If you could unmute, and we've already got quite a few questions coming in. First question, this is for, well, I think more for Dr. Smith. How do you reconcile the idea of covenants being consensual when people are born into them without consent?
That's a good question. And that's part of why the covenants over time become more tacit than explicit. When you're born into it, you grow up in it, you become a part of it, but it's not until you take the, you're old enough to become a citizen and to start voting where you have that choice. You choose to be a part of it. The idea goes back to Socrates, and what Plato wrote about Socrates, and when he was in jail, condemned to death for corrupting the youth, right? A friend came to him and said, "Hey, you could leave. We can break you out. We've made a deal with the jailer." And Socrates' response was, "I was free to leave at any time during my life, but I chose to stay. And in choosing to stay, I chose to abide by the laws of the city," which meant that I could try to change the laws I disagreed with, but I was subject to the laws and I need to be take them even if the decisions are unjust. And so to a certain extent, to the extent that we stay, that we participate, that we are actively engaged, we are endorsing the covenant, the compact of that system. Abraham Lincoln made a similar argument about the importance of obeying the law, even if you disagree with it. And he hated slavery, but he wasn't in favor of radical rebellion to overthrow that. He said, work within the system. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. gives us a different aspect to that. He agrees as well that we need to, if we agree to the laws, then we are part of that community and that society. He was willing to push it to the extent of breaking the laws and suffering the punishment, but in hopes that in doing that, it would strike the conscience of the people that these laws were unjust and needed to be changed. So the short answer is that to the extent that you remain and you participate in the system, you are buying in and you're accepting it. And the system is done well. It allows you to speak up, to be heard, and to influence and change the system in ways that change the things that you don't like.
Very good. Professor Ernst, do you want to add anything to that, or are we?
No, let's go to another question.
Okay, so and we've had quite a few questions for you, Professor Ernst, centering on religious freedom. So I think I have one that encapsulates many of them. It says, Professor Ernst, you've explained the admirable level of religious tolerance that the early Plymouth colony demonstrated. Did this heritage last into the following generations, or was it more short-lived?
Okay, thank you very much. That's a great question. And it really varied from colony to colony. You saw with respect to Plymouth colony, how there was a greater degree of toleration, although they were still somewhat intolerant. So they were kind of in the middle. The Massachusetts Bay colony, again, you saw with the Salem witch trials, it practiced an extreme amount of theocracy and religious intolerance toward others. And you can see in some of the other colonies in Rhode Island, in Connecticut, in Pennsylvania, how there was a much greater extent of religious freedom and a very great emphasis on the separation of church and state and on tolerance of all religions. So there was a diversity. It's not just one set mold. And of course, it ebbed and flowed over time as well. Interestingly, with the framers of the US Constitution, you'll notice in their verbiage, for example, they used the word creator in the Declaration of Independence. They did not use a specifically Christian term even. Many of the terms they used was the great architect or the great governor. Or the deity or divine providence. So they were referring to religion, but not necessarily specifically imposing a particular Christian view or one particular, Puritan or Anglican or what have you. So they really, really broadened the concept of religion, and you'll notice that in the original Constitution, the only reference to religion was the fact that there would be no religious tests. So anyone of any religion could come to could take an oath of office. You wouldn't have impose any particular religion on that. And then, of course, in the First Amendment are the Establishment Clause, which Thomas Jefferson, then the separation of church and state is actually not written into the Constitution. Many of us think that because that's such a common phrase. But Thomas Jefferson, when he was written a letter by Baptists, I believe it were, who were being persecuted, and they were concerned about that. And when Thomas Jefferson then became the third president of the United States, he wrote to him, hoping that he would preserve religious liberties. And that's when he wrote a letter back. And that's where that phrase, the separation of church and state, came about. So I could go on and on, but I'll hold off there.
No, thank you. And as a researcher of Roger Williams, I would point even further back to his ideas on he has a metaphor of the garden and introduced this notion of separation of church and state. And so yes, it was carries forward from that period. student question for Professor Smith. How did the proto-liberal ideas of covenant theory influence thinkers such as Hobbes, Locke, or other liberal theorists? Or did these later theorists develop their ideas separately?
Clearly influenced Hobbes. His social contract, a covenant, he even calls it a covenant, is clearly based in the ideas of federal theology. He secularizes it. He transforms the nature of it by, instead of being a covenant that's based with God from Adam and Abraham, he talks about the laws of nature. And that's a secularization of the ideas that gives us our current modern idea of natural law. But that's quite a bit different. But his essential ideas of that social covenant, the social compact, is really based in federal theology, and the others as well. They are drawing on that tradition. It's quite powerful and influential in their societies at the time.
Okay, thank you. And I think a final question for both of you. Could you elaborate as to the intended scope encapsulated by the contemporary understanding of equality for the Pilgrims?
Can you read that again?
Yes. Could you elaborate as to the intended scope encapsulated by the contemporary understanding of equality for the Pilgrims?
Okay. So just and equal laws, when they put just and equal laws in the compact. So again, I wish I could go back in time and hear their debates that they had and really see and hear what they thought about these ideas. And particularly, for example, none of the women signed the Mayflower Compact, but as we heard in the very first panel yesterday, women were expected to be were expected to know how to read, and were expected to contribute to both the church governance and the civil governance, and were expected to participate fully in society. So I could not hazard a guess in terms of what their actual conversations were around that, and if they might, some of them even have wanted to push even further with respect to equality. But I think the seeds of equality certainly was not the equality that we have today, meaning that all of the women, it would have been unheard of, for example, for a woman to be elected governor. I would hazard a guess. The historians would be much more likely to, but I think I'm pretty safe in saying that. So I don't think it was the equality as we conceptualize it today. And even in the Constitution, it was not equality as we conceptualize it today. And the Declaration of Independence, where they say all men are created equal, obviously they use the phrase men, and 20% of the United States were enslaved at the time. So they did not have that conceptualization of equality that we have today. But it was on this continuum, this growth, this planting the seeds and let it grow in terms of that part of our political philosophy that we have today as well.
Okay.
The idea of equality within the covenant is that the people entering into the covenant are equals, and there isn't a superior subordinate relationship between them, but that they approach each other as equals in entering into that relationship. Now, what comes after that, right? How people use the covenant relationship to benefit themselves, right? Some people will, emphasize material wealth, and some people may emphasize knowledge and other sorts of things. So you're going to get economic inequality. The idea is not, equality across the board all the way. The idea is that we are equals as individuals, and we can both enter into this relationship as equals, binding. One of the terms of ideas of freedom is that you are free to be able to bind yourself. In other words, you don't have a master who's bound you and determining what you can do. And so as equals, you enter into that covenant, but then what happens with that, right, is going to vary considerably, but you're still going to be treated as an equal before the law within the community and within the society. And I think it's important to point out that this is radical. This is, in their day and age, they have gentlemen and they have men and women and servants, right? It's a very hierarchical system. In fact, Howland on the Mayflower was a servant, and yet, as Julia pointed out, he is treated as an equal in the system before the system. So that's a radical leveling, but it's before the law. It's as in the relationship. It's not necessarily in the economics and other things that come after.
Thank you. And thank you both for your excellent presentations and for taking time to field questions from our viewers. Thank you for this session. It's been fantastic. Just been the chatter here in the center has picked up as you've been speaking. So thanks very much for that. And we want to thank all of you for joining us for this conference.